At its heart, this episode has a story of a mother's deep love for her son and her devastating grief at losing him to suicide. But it's also a story of extraordinary resilience and a determination to find good in the midst of grief. Jacqui Waring lost her son Will in July of 2024. Will had been diagnosed as schizophrenic, and at the time of his death, he had been sectioned and was receiving inpatient treatment at New Craig Psychiatric Hospital in Inverness. Somewhere, perhaps, you'd have thought he'd be safe from harm. In this episode, we'll be talking about why that wasn't the case and Jacqui's quest for change. These conversations, by their nature, are intended to be very open, honest and searching, but that doesn't always make them easy listening. So if you do find it too difficult, please press pause and get some support. You'll find all the details for Mikey's line in the show notes. I'm Penny Stewart and I'm talking to Jacqui Waring for this episode of Speaking of Suicide. Jacqui, can we start by maybe having a rummage around in some of your good memories of Will? Because I know there are many, many happy memories. Tell me a bit about him and your relationship.
Well, Will and myself and his big brother, we all grew and developed as a very tight-knit nuclear family, the three of us, in Inverness. Myself and Will's dad separated when he was 11. And we moved into town. I was very positive about that. My ebullient boys had everything on the doorstep. Inverness is a lovely town for that. It's everything in a small space. So all the transport options, all the opportunities for jobs as they grew up, places to meet friends, things to do. And we had a lively time. I developed a consultancy of my own. I've always worked with trees. So that was based on tree surveying in respect of development. So wherever in the Highlands development was going to happen, a tree survey would be required. And I did a great many of them. And the boys got used to coming out and working with me. We didn't do pocket money. We did paid to come and use the total station and do the measuring, and they were very keen indeed, and we had such a laugh. And I suppose I never noticed anything that gave me cause for concern with him. In a way, we lived an idyll for many years while my sons were growing up, and I know that many of their friends could not believe, particularly my eldest son's university friends could not believe how much freedom and how much exploration and how much enjoyment of the Highlands as they grew up they had enjoyed. So yeah, I'm rich and grateful in those ways for the time I got to spend with him.
At what point did you start to notice that Will had mental health issues? When did things shift from that idyll?
Well, that was the most difficult thing, and it's something I still wrestle with. And I appreciate this opportunity to talk about it because I think what I have to say may resonate with a lot of people who've dealt with a child or a young person as something like this has unfolded, because that's what it does. It doesn't happen all at once. The illness that Will eventually succumbed to is a very serious illness, and it is something that takes hold by stealth. So as he's growing up and developing, the teenage years as a mother raising teenage boys, you know that there are going to be challenges. You know that you are not always going to see eye to eye, that their personalities will develop and may be very different from your own. So there were things that at the time, both myself and his eldest brother just thought, this is Will. He has his own character, of course. There's one thing that comes to mind is he had a habit of coming into the living room, interrupting our conversation and just standing there looking at us and asking a question about something. Maybe it was something that happened in his day. Maybe it was something he was curious about that he thought we might have a perspective on. And I would begin to answer, and probably 2 sentences in, he would nod leave the room and close the door firmly behind him while I was in mid-flow. And he did this so often. And we used to laugh and tease him about it at the dinner table. And he didn't respond when we teased him. He just took it in good part and kind of stared at us. But now when I look back, I think, was that something of a shadow of a symptom? Disorganised ways of communication are symptomatic of serious mental illnesses like schizophrenia, and perhaps that was a precursor to there's no way I could have deemed it that at the time. As a loving parent, you just accept your child. We loved him exactly as he was. He chose not to go to university. He trained as a physical trainer in Edinburgh, and he wasn't interested in uni. He wasn't academic. His was the physical realm, and that was it. So I kind of thought he would do a lot of forming his personality and sorting himself out, as we might say, under my nose. So I did kind of dismiss a lot as him just going through phases. And I still think, certainly everything up until age probably 21 was within the realm of normal, I would say. There was nothing getting in the way of him living his life or us living ours. I think the milestone in the trajectory of his illness that first comes to mind is his decision to go and work in Australia for a year when he was 21. He had every ambition of going out there to make a life for himself. For him, it was the golden place. He'd read about it. It was very big on outdoor sports, and the fitness industry was massive out there, and the climate attracted him too. Why wouldn't it? A young person looking at the opportunities out there, he was very keen. So I did the thing I think that most mums would do, is made sure he had his head on straight about what it was going to be like, made sure he had enough money at least to get him there, on the basis he would need to work when he was there. And I just bravely decided to wish him well. I can see him now setting off down Fairfield Road towards the bus station, and I was waving at him. My eldest moved down to Bath around this time, and Will was off in Australia with every intention of earning his second-year visa and staying. So I set about moving south. I wasn't born in Scotland, and although I spent 28 years there, my parents are down in Somerset, a long way south, and they're getting elderly. And I wanted to take the opportunity to get a bit closer to them while there was still time, and before I was too old to contemplate a move of that magnitude. So everything was set to go south. And then Will's called me up and said, I haven't been feeling that well. He called me up from Australia and said, I haven't been feeling that well. I've been for blood tests and it's cost me £200. And I said, well, yes, it does over there. If you're not well, we'll have to do that thing that I said we could always do, and I'll get you home because you'll have the NHS. And he was very conflicted about that. He clearly had ambitions to stay in Australia. And we left it 48 hours and I sent him the money to cover his blood test. And when I did that, he just said, if you've got another 300 quid, I can book a flight back. And I thought, oh, wow, well, he's decided. And I was kind of relieved. I was delighted to see him again.
So he said he was feeling ill?
Yes, he said he wasn't feeling well. I think he had tried steroids in Australia, and he said that in Australia they were selling them from kiosks on the beach. So he had tried them and he said, I don't want to be on them anymore. He said, I've read up about it and there are side effects if you come off these things. And then he said, and I'll never forget it, he said, one of them is suicidal ideation. And I was shocked as a mother. I was shocked. And however, if you bear in mind this conversation was happening in the context of what might happen if he let go of the steroids. And I said, well, that's the best idea, though. We'll deal with whatever we need to. Come home and you can get, a bit of medical support to do that. When I look back on it, I'm not at all sure that was the first time he had wrestled with suicidal ideation. I think it came too readily into the conversation for this to have been a sudden thing. And when he arrived back in the UK, I was delighted to see him, but there was something amiss. And the only way I can describe it is he seemed to be surrounded by a big black cloud. It wasn't the Will that left to go to Australia.
So he comes back from Australia, something feels not quite right, and there's this dark cloud over him. That feels still quite a long way from having a diagnosis of schizophrenia. So when did that come into the picture, and what form did his schizophrenia take in terms of his behaviour?
I think for the longest time, and probably for, well, up to 5 years, I think we were unknowingly wrestling with the onset of schizophrenia, but trying to find other ways of explaining what was going on. And this is where I felt there was an absolute dearth of any meaningful support. When he came back from Australia, at my insistence, he did go to see the GP. He did ask for some talking therapy, I believe, but he was refused because he didn't meet certain criteria. He was on antidepressants for about 5 days, and then he said, to heck with this, I'm not depressed. So again, I quite liked hearing that. So I wasn't too worried about him then. He'd had a year in Australia. He seemed to be improving, and his spirits were good. And I headed south. He seemed to do not too badly, with the odd hiccup of something that myself and my eldest son couldn't work out what was going on. Sometimes he would message late at night and we didn't find the message till the morning, and it would be slightly abusive in tone or just puzzling, confusing. But when we would then get back in touch with him, everything would be normal again. I think my eldest son was more concerned than I was at that time. He would say, well, I think he's got some work to do on himself, but let him be. He's a young man. He'll sort himself out. But then in 2022, he lost a very close friend. Someone he'd grown up with took his own life on the Black Isle, and I think he found that extremely difficult. It was a massive knock for him, and I suspect now that he may have been experiencing symptoms that he couldn't explain, but he didn't want to bring them in front of me. You cannot expect someone who is developing a serious mental illness to be able to tell you what is happening to them. That is part of the picture. If someone is actually losing their mind, which is what schizophrenia is, they are very unlikely to be able to articulate what's happening to them. They don't know. And so when I would ask him if he was okay, I had a few conversations that went along that. Because again, as a mother, you're trying to be very supportive. So I would say, do you think there's something getting in the way of you achieving your goals in life, and try to open that up? But that's when he became very reluctant to talk about his future. And that worried me, particularly in light of this, as I say, of this, having experienced a very close friend take his life. It was like a ratcheting up of the suicidal concern for me, which I really didn't want to face. No parent wants to think this can really be true. So you tend to explain it any other way you can, and just, again, think, well, I've given him, a loving upbringing. I've tried to make him strong. He's going to see this through. He'll be okay. But who you could actually go to, I rang many a helpline. I was on helplines every other day to try and get some advice. But everywhere I turned, I was told the sufferer, the person I was concerned about, would have to go and seek help for themselves. Again, they're not going to. They're not able to. And I think, having thought about this quite a lot in the wake of what happened, I think people like my son, suffering as they are, become very afraid. It's beyond anxious. I think they become very afraid of what's happening to them and what will happen to them if they surface that. It can be hard enough for us to go to see a doctor about something that's bothering us, even in everyday terms. But if you think, he was worried about things like his cognition, I believe, and his ability to read other people. So he felt very at a loss in the world, as if he couldn't function properly. I think having to take that to somebody and talk about it would be very, very hard if you were in your right mind. And if you weren't, it would be impossible.
Entirely. I think that the whole problem with this is when someone's ill and experiencing the symptoms of serious mental illness, the last thing they want to do, or I think feel capable of, is going and expressing that to a doctor. And when they're in a period of relatively good mental health, the last thing they want to do is go and open up that can of worms by going and taking it to a doctor. So they're in a continuous loop.
Yes.
And that's so difficult. So how did he eventually get diagnosed as being schizophrenic, if this was a kind of back note to all this?
We had concerns that were building, and I got him down here. And he was down here with me for 7 months. Again, something I'll be eternally grateful for is that extra time, although it did turn out to be very difficult. There was clearly something the matter. He had psychosis, but I didn't know what that was in order to recognise it. I just knew that sometimes he made no sense. Sometimes we'd be having arguments and I would think, I don't think he's arguing with me. You know, at that time, I'm absolutely certain now that he was hearing voices, but he hadn't mentioned that, so I didn't know. He wasn't making sense about things. He would have conversations and pretend he was on the phone through his headphones, and now I just don't think he was. He used to put me on hold and he'd say, oh, stop, I haven't time for you now, I'm talking to He wasn't talking to anyone, except in his head. His behaviour became worrying to me. He was prone to bursts of aggression, which I couldn't understand. Again, coming out of his own head, and he would go out and drink heavily, more heavily than I've ever seen him drink. Now knowing what was troubling him, this is often seen as a way to try and self-medicate, or if things are troubling you deeply, it's a way of blocking that out. He then, early autumn, I think, early September of 23, he made the decision he would like to go to Edinburgh. He's always liked Edinburgh, and he said, I want to go, will you help me get started up there? So myself and my eldest son, we both said, yes, I think that's a good idea. Again, there's always that feeling. He really resented, he wouldn't even let me drive him around places when he was staying with me. He said he didn't want to be seen as hanging out with his mother. And so after a point you think, well, are you better? Will you recover better? Will you stabilise on your own if we help you? And that's what we did. And at first it wasn't too bad, but my eldest son was paying for him to stay in hostels. So this, you can see the trajectory of this. It is going from bad to worse. He didn't seem to be able to find himself a flat, even though I offered it, the deposit was there. I offered him money. He didn't seem to be able to undertake that. And he ended up in the homeless hostel. We couldn't work out why. We thought, I'd seen him drinking heavily. I thought, is that the problem? It's hard to know whether drugs are involved. Has he got in with money lenders? We didn't know. But every time I gave him money, we didn't know where it went. It can't feel good for somebody to be that dependent on family members and to know that they aren't coping the way they should be. Just before Christmas of 2023, I went up to Edinburgh. Again, he said he had worries about his health, so I agreed to take him out to dinner. I didn't have much time, I was still working, but I said, let's go out to dinner and have a chat about this. We had a lovely dinner, but there was very odd behaviour. For a start, he seemed to think he had a brain tumour. And I said, well, in that case, you must just go to hospital, just go straight away. I could take you to an A&E. He said his cognitive abilities had decreased. And I noticed at a point when he went to the loo, he was recording the conversation on his phone, the conversation we were having, which I thought was odd. The next morning, having breakfast, I brought to his attention some symptoms of schizophrenia that I found on my phone. And I said, look, have a look at this. Does this ring any bells for you? I asked him for the very first time on that morning, do you hear voices? And he said yes. And he looked at these symptoms and he scrolled and scrolled and scrolled. And he said, how did you know about this? And I said, well, it's just an idea I had. You pick things up through life. You read things, And I said, look, does that convince you that you should go and get some help? Here, I had found helplines, phone lines, specific ones saying, are you hearing voices? Here's someone to talk to. And I said, A&E again, you can go there. But he was no, I'll be fine. And to be honest, he looked really good. He's always looked good. He's quite handsome. He looked healthy. It was difficult to argue with him. It was difficult to see us in an outright emergency situation. So I went back home. I then sent him a lot of money because we'd agreed. He said, I've realised that everything you've ever said was right, and all I need to do is get a good job and then find myself somewhere to live. Can you help with that? I'm a mum, and even though I'd been doing it for years, I still said, yeah, of course I can. I was delighted. I was on cloud 9. This was everything I'd ever wanted to hear. And I was so thrilled. I remember texting my eldest saying, he's finally turned the corner. He's finally going to do this. Whatever his issues, he's getting it right. So I sent him quite a lot of money. It must have been upwards of, it was 3.5 grand, something like that. But I thought he was going in the right direction. This was the point in, I think it was February 2024. He went quiet for a while, but not for very long. We were in constant touch and I hadn't worried about him that much. I thought he was on track. And then a close friend of mine, very close friend of mine, she's actually the mother of the friend that Will lost to suicide, and she lives close by. She said, I'd found she'd been on the phone all night to me and I'd switched mine off. So I rang her in the morning. She said, come over. And she told me, she said, I don't know quite how to say this, but Will has been in touch with me and said that he's in Brazil. And I said, no. He's in Edinburgh. He's not. I actually thought, I said, he's having some kind of an episode. We have to get the police to do a welfare check. And we got in touch with them. They weren't keen to look into it until, I think it was his half-sister went into the Inverness police because she knew he'd been actually up there rather than Edinburgh, and said, he has gone missing. You have to find him. He's gone missing. And they were brilliant, and they got Interpol involved. And indeed, he'd gone to Rio de Janeiro on a flight. I mean, I had no knowledge about this. He'd left the country with the money I'd sent him, gone to Brazil, and then he'd gotten a bus to Sao Paulo, and they found him in a hostel in Sao Paulo. And when we started to talk to him on WhatsApp, he was clearly very unwell. And I then had the support of, other parts of the family. We were all on a group trying to talk to him and support him. So the kind of thing I was getting was, no, I'm doing fine. I've been down on the beach and there's some young women there and they're selling beer. And they said, I can sell beer with them. The only problem is, as I'm looking at them, they're turning into men. And, you hear these things and you just think, this is really, really bad. And fair play to his aunt, Siobhan, who was in Dublin. And this is the wonderful world we're in, where everyone can come together in an effort like this, wherever they are. And she seemed to be able to cope with time differences and everything and get Deliveroo to bring him food at the hostel. And there was an awful day where he said he had no water and was thirsty, and would I send him £10 into his bank account? And the police said to me, no, don't do it. For £10 he can get over to the other side of Brazil and we'll never see him again. That was so hard for me. I had to come off the WhatsApp, because when your child is asking for water, I can only thank his half-sister who got in touch with me another way and said, I've done the Googling, and Sao Paulo has public water fountains everywhere. She said, don't worry about him, don't worry. So it was an extraordinarily difficult time. It was about 2 weeks. We got him a flight booked, but then the task was, how do you get somebody so seriously mentally dysfunctional to fall in with your plans? How would we get him to a place on time, get him into a taxi? So I'll be forever grateful to every member of the family that contributed this and talked him round and supported him. We got him on the plane. It was then 16 hours with no contact, and it was stopping off in Milan, so we were all terrified that by the time the plane got to London, he just wouldn't be on it. But he turned up, he arrived, the police apprehended him then, but didn't seem to do much. We didn't hear from them. This has been a problem all along, this confidentiality thing, whereas they would speak to him but not tell us, the family who had just rescued him from the other side of the world against the odds. They were not prepared to keep us informed in any way, shape or form. And then we had to get him on a bus at Victoria, got him on there, got him to Edinburgh. And then he said, no, I'm staying the night here. And he made up stories about going looking for his lost laptop. And again, I had to come off the group, so close and yet so far. I had phoned our family doctor in Inverness about all of this and said he's not even in this country, he's on the other side of the world, but can you red flag him for an emergency appointment if we get him back? And they were so good. This is one outfit I have to pay credit to. They said, yeah, they took all the details. They said, we've got his history here, even though he hasn't come to us about this, but we know him from a child. So we will flag this, we will get him in as soon as you get him back. And that was so nail-biting again, got him back in to Inverness. She took him, his half-sister took him. I said, promise him a big breakfast if he'll go, whatever you like, I'll put some money in your account, you know. And she got him there to the doctor, and he was immediately referred up to New Craigs, where he told them all about the voices he was hearing. He was being pursued by anonymous people who were threatening to tear him limb from limb. And they asked, well, what's your plan if they catch up with you? And he said, I keep a rope in my backpack. And immediately he was sectioned, you know, because he was a danger to himself. At which point, when they told him, he did a runner immediately, and the police had to chase him across Inverness and had to use pepper spray to apprehend him. He's quite tall, he was quite well built, he was very fit. Despite it all, that's a sort of poignant thing, really. And then he was up at New Craigs, and they had to diagnose him.
This, I mean, I've no doubt this must have had a massive impact on you. You've had to come off that WhatsApp group a few times when it has all been too much. And as a mum, this beautiful boy of yours, who you've got such wonderful memories with, is clearly tormented. Jacqui, are you able to put into words what this did to you as his mum?
I felt like I was in a tunnel. There was no way out of it except through. I didn't know where that was going to end up, but I was solely focused, as I now realise I probably had been for some time, on getting him in front of a clinician. I knew that's what he needed, but trying to achieve that had been next to impossible. And that still haunts me, that should not be the case in our mental health system. I'm sure from everything I've said you could tell I had very serious concerns, which I personally could have articulated to anybody who would have listened. But I could not get anybody who could help to listen. So actually when he was sectioned, there was a weird sense of relief. We'd got him to a place of safety where there would be doctors, there would be specialists. Somebody would understand what was going on for him, and somebody would be able to treat him. We were suddenly hopeful, having got him back from this dreadful, the time when he was in Brazil, there was a worse nightmare than the one I was living through, and that was that his phone just went dead and we never heard from him again. And how I would have lived the rest of my life if that had happened, I just don't know. So again, it's a very odd thing to say, but I am grateful that didn't happen, despite everything that did. We got him back. We got him in front of the clinicians who were going to try and help him. And I think I probably slept a night for the first time possibly in years. I slept properly the first night he was in the hospital. He was safe. The place was, he had a bed, he had meals, he had kind people around him. He wasn't homeless, he wasn't in a foreign country, and he wasn't vulnerable when he was among them. But of course it didn't end well.
It didn't, and we will come on to that. But it's, as a parent, we can't help but have our own vision of the future and what we anticipate it will look like when you have a child. That's part and parcel of being a mum, being a parent. You don't want to put pressure on your children, but you still have ambitions for happiness, if nothing else, for them. And it's clear that what Will was going through would not have been anything you'd have wished for him. Yeah. And I just, I'm trying to imagine how that has felt for you, seeing your child struggle so much.
It's catastrophically heartbreaking. That's the only way to describe it. It is. I started to grieve for everything he was losing long before we lost him. When things get that serious, it wasn't just him that couldn't see any future clearly, it was me too. I couldn't work out how this was going to go. But like I say, you develop this, it is your child, you develop this stoicism that says, one step at a time, we'll see what treatment's available, we'll see what support we need to give, and hopefully at this point, now, everything else having happened, we can turn this thing around with the medical help that will now be available. At that point anyway, I was kind of adjusting from the absolute despair about how the direction of travel his life seemed to be taking and the struggle he was having, to something that there were the green shoots of hope coming through, that his future might not be what he envisioned, what any of us envisioned, but he would have one. And we would help him with that, and we would have him around. And I would tell him on phone conversations in the hospital, that was all we were looking. We couldn't think about anything else. We just wanted him to get well and get out, and we'd have a party, and we'd have good times again. And I just reminded him of all the beautiful things in the world. It was so difficult though, because I still felt I was fighting this demon that showed him suicide as an option inside his head. I had to fight it so often, give him all these pep talks about how beautiful the world was and how getting him back from Brazil was so extraordinary, that if he could, get back his life and use his story to help other people, that he would find that so worthwhile. I told him that, and so many other things. But again, it took everything I had. It took everything I had to keep that up. It was utterly exhausting. And you were just waiting day to day for the antipsychotics to kick in, for something good to happen, and the news just never seemed to come. In fact, the news that did come were his repeated absconsions. He got out of the high security psychiatric hospital 4 times. He escaped. Once he went over a 12-foot wall, and every time it happened, the police were called, and there was at least 48 hours of your nerves absolutely being shredded. Would they find him? If they found him, were they going to find a body? Why had he done this? What was the rationale? Where had he gone? He had no money, he had no phone when he was getting out. He made it as far as Edinburgh by climbing on a bus behind the bus driver's back. And he was only caught when he gave my name as his next of kin. And my name was all over that police database. So we got him. Every time we got him back, I was just, the waves of relief. But you just kept thinking, how long can we go on like this? There's got to be a seismic change for the better. We were hanging on for dear life for that.
Let's pause there for 2 seconds. If you're listening to this and it is striking a chord and you need someone to talk to, you can text Mikey's line. The number is 07786 20 77 55, or contact them via Messenger, web chat and WhatsApp. The number for WhatsApp is 01463 729 000. If you're in the Highlands, you can go and visit them at the Hive, 4 Struthers Lane, Inverness. They're open 7 days a week from 6 p.m. to 10 p.m. All those details and extra links will be in the show notes. So Jacqui, there you were with hope, hoping that something could change, that this couldn't go on. Unfortunately, of course, it didn't go on. What happened when Will eventually decided to take his life?
I was in close touch with the hospital. I had been up there and I knew them to be looking after him. They were fantastically kind, the people actually on the ground looking after him. I was not certain that his treatment was either working or appropriate. That's the mind space you get into if something isn't generating positive effects. You wonder, is it the right treatment? Is the diagnosis right? You wonder all those things. it seemed to be taking a long time. And into this, though, came the news that he had been taken out to register for some more homeless accommodation. And otherwise, they were planning to look to how they would put him back into the community, which I was frightened about. I thought that was very premature. I thought he needed at least another 6 months. And then I had a conversation with him. It was the Friday night. And the conversation I had just had so many red flags. So he talked about, have you got my hard drive from my computer? I think I left it at your house, only it's my legacy, which is not a word you use in everyday speech. He was also, I can't stay in here any longer. You know that, don't you? I can't stay here any longer. I will get out of here, he said. And it was just the way he said it that I thought he meant more than just another escape. And there were a couple of other things. And I rang the ward, even though it was late, it was after 10, and I rang them and said, look, I'm very anxious because of the way he's been talking to me. And I remember someone said to me, there's only so much we can do. And I remember that actually was quite hurtful, because I thought, well, he's only in that hospital for one reason, and that is to prevent him doing the thing we're most afraid of. So I don't think that's, even if it's something someone felt, I didn't think it was something that should have been said. But on the other hand, the chap was very nice and said, I'll keep an eye on him tonight, and then when the shift changed, I'll let the next person know you had concerns. And I was a long way away. And then on the Sunday, we heard he'd absconded again. He'd been allowed out for a walk. And again, this was something I was very anxious about, the free time they gave him outside. But it was something they were doing to try and instill hope. And so I understood that, to try and get him to feel that he wouldn't always be penned in. He loved the outdoors so much. And he would love to go for a run or a walk. But I remember phoning his aunt Siobhan, who'd been so helpful in getting him out of Brazil, and saying, I'm not sure how many more times I can actually do this, to have him disappear and the police go and look for him and everybody is completely strung out. And I was working in the garden, and then his dad phoned about 8 o'clock, and I knew straight away I was going to hear the worst news in the world. Excuse me. But it's odd, because I felt instantly an immediately inrush of gratitude for all the time I'd spent with him, all the good times, all the fact that we got him back from Brazil. That was thing I offered prayers for, and the fact that I had given him everything I could to try and prevent this scenario. I didn't get the help I would have wanted to do it, and obviously everything I so dearly wanted to accomplish in the end came to nothing. But I was so glad that I had tried. I was so glad of the sleepless nights, of the money I'd supplied, of the talks we'd had, of how much I'd let him know that he was cared about and loved, and that when he lost faith in his own future, that I was still there selling it to him. All of that gave me enormous strength. I just also felt a need, and this happens to a lot of people, to try and do something to make sure that other people didn't have to suffer the extreme ends of the experience I had had. Anything I could do was going to be worthwhile, as far as I could think at that time. But it was tough. It was really tough. I mean, that whole story I just told you is a nightmare scenario for every parent. Absolute nightmare. Yeah. And you never think it's going to happen to you. You never think that the thing will run like a snowball, gathering pace to this absolutely appalling end. And I'll never know what it was in his mind eventually when he did it, but it was something that was in the wings for a long time. And certainly whatever was happening up at the hospital didn't shift that. And that was my main concern when I finally plucked up the courage to get in touch with them and say, I want to be part of your internal investigation. As I felt I wanted to know where the deficiencies had been and try and help plug those for anyone else.
How difficult was it to move from that intense grief to actually wanting to go and explore and confront and understand what had happened at the hospital and seek change?
Well, it wasn't easy. It certainly wasn't easy. My experience of my bereavement, and other people's experiences will be different, I know that, is that it comes in waves. I had a lot of great support from Cruise Bereavement Counselling. My counsellor was absolutely fantastic. There were days where I did better than some other days. And in the days where I had some energy, my thoughts did turn to whether I could, what even tiny positive thing I could wring from this. And I know a lot of bereaved parents will know exactly what I'm talking about. It's a natural human impulse, I think. And I was aware that, I have a responsible executive job. I'm well practiced at dealing with the kind of thing I would need to deal with if I wanted to go and participate in anything belonging in the NHS. I was daunted, and there were days I didn't cope with it. There were days where I felt completely overwhelmed. I am human, but I also, I took my son's, the level of determination he could muster when he wanted to do something was awesome. And up at his ceremony we had in Inverness, I had used the word to his totally bereft friends. I'd said, the thing he was unstoppable. So none of us could have prevented this outcome. They were so torn apart with grief and guilt. Everyone feels guilt in the aftermath of a suicide. Everyone wants to know if they couldn't have been the one to have made the call that would have stopped this happening. It's absolutely awful. And I felt so much for them. And so to actually name that, to tell them that I knew him to be unstoppable and that was his decision. He had his autonomy, and he would have wanted us to respect that at the end of the day. And when on days where I was very clear about the levels of determination he had shown me and how I admired that most of the time in him, I admired it. Then I thought, I do believe, that people don't just disappear completely, and that the part of him that goes on would have been lending me strength to try and help someone else. It was almost as if I'd try and encourage him to come back to us and use his story to help others. And I felt perhaps he's handing the baton on. Perhaps I can do that for him, for both of us, and for everyone else who may not have the skills that I have. I'm good at writing. I'm good at getting my point across. And I knew I would do well in the meetings I would have to have. There's a sense in which the strongest among us have to pick up the baton and go forward. And that was very much how I felt.
I think listening to you, it is no surprise that you had ears at the NHS, that people wanted to listen to your story and to your experiences and to your insight into where changes needed to happen. Where have things got to with that? First of all, what changes did you decide to seek, and how hopeful are you that they will be implemented?
Well, my thanks go out to Neil McNamara, the head of psychiatry at New Craigs, because I approached him and we managed to forge the kind of relationship which facilitated our intermittent discussions during the internal investigation that had to happen in the wake of my son's death. If he hadn't been open to that, or if he'd been in any way awkward and unsupportive, then of course I wouldn't be speaking to you now about this. It's obviously, I won't go through the whole thing, but we managed to thrash out 9 issues which myself and my eldest son thought could well have contributed to the outcome, and the hospital agreed to put all of those issues up to adopt them all as concrete changes to be taken forward on an agreed timeline, and that has all been verified, and I have dates, some of them. I think most of them will be up by this December, so I will do some catching up with what's happened. The most important of them, to my mind, were I questioned the paucity, the lack of psychotherapy that was offered to my son, because to my view, in my mind, whether or not someone is suffering from a severe clinical illness, which is distorting their appreciation of reality, somebody doesn't take their own life without rationalising why that's necessary. And I think a good psychotherapist would have been able to get in amongst that and at least try to unpack it. And I think that could have made a very great difference. I heard afterwards that there was only one psychotherapist serving the entire of the Highlands, and I thought that was absolutely atrocious. I was having to fulfil that role at times, and I couldn't be a mother and a psychotherapist. That was just too hard, and yet I had to. And I think if he had someone going in every day to have won his trust and then tried to get behind what was going on in his thinking, that could only have helped. The hospital made the argument that, well, what they actually said was it would have been difficult to get him to have cooperated with therapy. And that was the one time in our discussions when I saw red, because to me, I think I came back with something like, well, if it had been easy, we would have done it. He was in a psychiatric hospital for a reason. You know, they do hard things, supposedly. This is supposed to be the point. So that is going to be taken forward. There's going to be a report to try and evaluate whether, well, I think they already know the provision they've got isn't adequate. So the report will look into how they can improve on that and what it's going to cost, which I think is crucial. Also, things along the lines of just the support for families. There was nothing given to me of telling me what I should expect when my son was admitted to a psychiatric hospital. Nothing given to me to explain what schizophrenia is, what the treatment might be, what I should look out for, what he's going to be going through, side effect. There was none of that. I picked up what I could pick up during phone calls to the ward. So there's a lot of work to be done there, I think, but they have taken that on board. There was a wholesale review of the psychology provision for inpatients, which is quite extraordinary. So, and STORM training, which is skills training on risk management with regard to self-harm and suicide prevention. I mean, they do it anyway, but evidently there are improvements that could be made. And then finally, about this whole support for families, not only who are dealing with illnesses like schizophrenia and psychosis, but also for families affected by suicide. The hospital could do quite a lot more. It does go out like a ripple, the bad energy out of something like this. A lot of people can find themselves very badly affected. We're all fragile in that sense, and it saves, you can support communities so much better if you can acknowledge that they really do need support after something like this happens.
Jacqui, it's been extraordinary privilege listening to you talk about Will and what you've been through, and to hear what you've been doing to implement change. How would you like to remember your determined and beautiful boy? How will you remember him going forward?
Well, right at the moment, I would say he's still with me every day. So I remember the wonderful times we spent together, but I respect his decision making because he was such a strong and bold character. And if I feel to myself, if he wasn't going to be able to live the life he felt he could have, then he chose a different option, and that was his right. So I remember him with the greatest respect, and I also know that he will be looking down on me. There are things I do that I know would make him smile, and as I say, I think every day he lends me strength to go through this. This is not something I'll ever be able to unwind. This is with me for life, And it's weird, but in a strange way, we're still in it together. And I think only a mother knows what that means. You're in it together from before they're born and even after they're gone.
Jacqui, thank you so much for talking to me on Speaking of Suicide. Now here's Shona from Mikey's Line with a few thoughts to take away from the conversation I've had with Jacqui today.
Listening to Jacqui tell her and Will's story, I think that should be mandatory listening for anyone working in mental health services. It's such a powerful description of somebody becoming unwell. Her description of the slow and subtle changes that she noticed when Will was younger, and then that gradual increase of behaviour changes and signs that things weren't right for Will. Such an articulate description of someone developing schizophrenia, and such a strong illustration of the immense pressure and frustration and powerlessness it can put on us as parents or partners or siblings or friends when we see a loved one suffer and we want to advocate for them, and yet we feel like no one is actually really listening to us. Everyone is saying they'll only listen to the service user. And I know as a therapist myself, sometimes parents get in touch or partners get in touch, and I'm often, can you get the person to get in touch themselves? That's kind of what we often do. And this has made me really want to think about that more. Time and again, Jacqui's gut told her something wasn't right, and she always did what she could. But it wasn't heard, or not heard enough, or somehow fell between the cracks of an underfunded service provision. And I almost didn't know what to share. There's so much to share, to reflect on in this piece. But I thought I could just end by highlighting some words that Jacqui said towards the end. And I thought, I do believe people don't just disappear completely. Part of Will that goes on would be lending me strength to try and help someone. And so it sounds like Jacqui is channeling Will's life force to help others where he was failed. And that the New Craigs, the hospital in Inverness, are listening. Fair credit to them, they're listening. They want to increase psychotherapy provision for inpatients, support for families when relatives are admitted, education for families, further training for staff, self-harm and suicide prevention, in service of other lives being saved, in service of people getting that life-changing support that means that staying can be an option for them. It didn't feel like staying was an option for Will, but hopefully these ripples will make a difference, and a difference that goes beyond just service position in the Highlands. It's something that we nationally need to be better at. So I want to thank Jacqui for her courage in what she's doing, and within this interview. All of these interviews touch me deeply, and this one particularly I think is going to stay with me in my job as a psychotherapist and thinking of families as well. So thank you.
Shona McPherson. Don't forget, if you need someone to talk to or some help, then you can text Mikey's Line on 07786 20 77 55, or you can contact them via Messenger, web chat and WhatsApp. The number for WhatsApp is 01463 729000, or you can go and visit them at The Hive, 4 Struthers Lane, Inverness. They're open 7 days a week from 6pm to 10pm, and all those details and links are in the show notes. Speaking of Suicide is funded by Mikey's Line, and the platform is sponsored by Highland-based family firm D&D Paving Limited. If you'd like to share your story or sponsor an episode or series, do get in touch. We'd love to hear from you. Speaking of Suicide is produced by Adventurous Audio Limited.